The clock ticked toward late afternoon, but the air in room 214 felt electric, as if the walls themselves could sense what was coming. Liana Carter stood at the front, her voice steady as she read the detention list, Tyler Maddox's name lingering in the air like a challenge. His smirk was slow, deliberate, the kind that carried an unspoken threat. Outside, the muffled sounds of the school faded, leaving only the taut silence between them. Just before the door swung open, the rain had stopped just before dawn, leaving the streets of Ridgeview shining like sheets of glass. Liana Carter parked her modest silver sedan outside the high school's brick facade and sat for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel. 28 years old, a literature teacher with a decade of Brazilian jiu-jitsu training behind her, she had left the noise and shadows of Atlanta for this quiet town. Or at least, she had been told it was quiet. She stepped out, her heels clicking against the damp pavement, the morning air cool and carrying the faint scent of pine from the surrounding hills. Ridgeview High loomed ahead, rows of windows still dark, the flag out front hanging limp in the still air. Her pulse was steady, but there was an alertness in her eyes, the same focus she had carried into every competition mat. Inside, the halls were lined with metal lockers and bulletin boards layered with years of flyers. She was early. Most teachers were still in their cars or sipping coffee in the lounge. Then, from around the corner, a sound broke the quiet, metal clanging. Then a frustrated sigh. A boy, maybe 14, stood hunched over a locker door that refused to open. His backpack hung lopsided on one shoulder, and his knuckles were red from trying to pry it loose. "Good morning," Liana said, her voice warm but firm. "Need a hand?" The boy looked up, startled. "It's stuck. I have been trying for 10 minutes. I think someone jammed it." She crouched, examined the lock, then reached into her bag for a thin metal bookmark, her favorite tool for unjamming stubborn locks. A careful twist, a practiced nudge, and the latch popped free. The boy's face lit with relief. "Thank you. I thought I was going to be late for homeroom. Get to class," she said, smiling. "And keep an eye out. If anyone tries this again, tell a teacher." Oh, the moment was small, but it was the kind that settled her purpose here. People deserved someone willing to stand beside them, even in small battles. In her new classroom, Liana began arranging her notes for the first period. The room smelled faintly of chalk and wood polish. She flicked on the projector to test it. The image on the screen flickered, then died in a burst of static. She frowned, tapped the side of the machine, and saw it spark faintly before going dark again. She could call the tech department. That would be the procedure. But the day was about to start, and she preferred to keep moving. She would fix it herself later, she decided, and went back to arranging the handouts. It was not the first time she had chosen to handle things alone. By the time the first bell rang, sunlight had spilled across the rows of desks. Students filed in, some curious about the new teacher, others indifferent. She introduced herself, outlined the syllabus, and began the day's lesson on character motivation in classic literature. She had just written a quote on the board when the classroom door opened hard enough to rattle the glass. 3 boys stepped in without knocking. The one in the lead was tall, broad-shouldered, with an easy athletic posture and hair cut close on the sides. His Letterman jacket gleamed in Ridgeview's crimson and white. Tyler Maddox. Even without the whispers from the students, the name was easy to place. Captain of the football team, son of Robert Maddox, the mayor. "Miss Carter," he said, voice pitched to Carrie, "we need to talk." "You are interrupting my class," she replied, setting the marker down. "This can wait until after the lesson." "No, it cannot," Tyler said, stepping forward. The 2 boys behind him lingered near the door like shadows. She waited. "You failed me on my essay," he said. "You are going to change it." "It was 60% plagiarized," Liana said evenly. "The grade stands." A ripple of murmurs passed through the room. Some students looked down at their desks. Others glanced between them, sensing a confrontation. Tyler's jaw tightened. "You do not know who you are dealing with. My father runs this town." Then he should understand the importance of honesty in work, she said. The room felt smaller now, the air thicker. Tyler stepped closer, until he stood on the edge of the space behind her desk. He smiled, but it was not friendly. It was the slow, deliberate smile of someone testing the edge of a threat. The students held their breath, and in that moment, Leanna Carter knew that her first day at Ridgeview High was not going to be quiet at all. The silence in the room was fragile, as if one sharp word could shatter it. Tyler's smile lingered, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed a simmering impatience. Leanna stood still, her breathing slow and measured, the posture of someone who understood the value of not moving too soon. Then, a small motion broke the stillness. From the edge of her vision, she saw one of Tyler's friends, a wiry boy with restless eyes, drift toward her desk. His steps were quiet, deliberate, the way a hand might slide toward a card in a game. His gaze fixed not on her, but on the stack of graded essays that lay neatly in the corner of her desk. Leanna's mind catalogued the scene in an instant. The boy's trajectory, the angle of his arm, the faint rustle of papers as his hand reached forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not lunge. Instead, she pivoted smoothly, her hand rising in a calm arc until her fingers encircled his wrist. The boy froze, startled by the sudden contact. Leanna's grip was firm but controlled, her thumb pressing lightly against the tendons, her other fingers guiding his hand upward just enough to shift his balance. It was a wrist control technique she had practiced thousands of times, to El Sage, designed to stop motion, not cause pain. "This is my desk," she said softly, her voice carrying across the room. "Do not touch what is not yours." The boy's eyes widened, the bravado draining from his face. She released him with the same care she had taken to restrain him. He stumbled back a step, his wrist unhurt but his composure fractured. A ripple of whispers swept through the room. One student gasped audibly. Another, near the back, had already lifted a phone, its camera glinting in the sunlight streaming through the windows. The faint sound of a video recording tone cut through the hush. Leanna straightened, her expression unchanged. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, measuring the scene, wondering what would happen next. This was not a moment she had sought, but she knew it was one she had to own. Tyler's smile vanished. The mask of casual superiority hardened into something darker. "You just made a mistake," he said, his voice low and sharp. "You will regret this." The words did not raise her pulse. She had heard threats before, on competition mats, in crowded gyms, even in the parking lot of her old school, when she had stepped between a student and a group of older boys. Threats were wind. They passed. But this one was different in one way. It came with the weight of his father's name. "I enforce the rules here," she replied. "The same rules for everyone." The phone in the back caught her profile as she spoke, the way the sunlight traced the line of her cheekbone, the stillness in her eyes. She wondered if the clip would find its way beyond this room before the day ended. Tyler leaned forward, placing both hands on the edge of her desk. The movement was meant to close the distance, to reclaim the ground he felt he had lost. "We will see how long you last," he said. For a moment, their eyes locked. His gaze was all calculation and warning. Hers was steady, unyielding. It was not a contest of strength, but of presence. She did not blink. The bell rang, the sound breaking the spell. Students began to gather their things, the scrape of chairs and the shuffle of books filling the space. Tyler lingered a second longer, then turned on his heel and strode out, his friends following close behind. Leanna exhaled slowly, the tension easing from her shoulders. She collected the essays and placed them in her drawer, locking it with a small key she kept on a chain around her neck. She had not intended to begin her time at Ridgeview High this way, but the tone had been set. Boundaries had been drawn. The rest of the day unfolded in a blur of lessons and quiet conversations. A few students lingered after class to ask about assignments, their glances toward the door betraying the unspoken thought. "Is Tyler waiting out there?" By the time the last bell of the afternoon rang, the halls had thinned. Liana gathered her bag and walked toward the faculty parking lot. The air had warmed, carrying the scent of cut grass from the football field. She could hear the distant thud of a ball being punted, the shouts of players running drills. Her silver sedan stood in its assigned spot, sunlight flashing off the windshield. But she was not alone. Near the far end of the row, leaning casually against a black pickup truck, Tyler and two of his friends stood talking. Their conversation paused as she approached. One of them nudged the other, and all three turned to watch her. They did not speak. They only smiled, slow, deliberate smiles that followed her every step until she unlocked her car. Liana placed her bag in the passenger seat, her movements calm, her breathing steady. She closed the door and sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. In it, she saw the reflection of three figures still standing, still watching, their presence heavy even at a distance. She started the engine, the sound breaking the afternoon quiet, and drove away. But the feeling stayed. A shadow at the edge of her thoughts. She had set her boundaries, but the challenge had only just begun, and deep down, she knew they would test them again. The morning broke cold and brittle, the kind of dawn where the air feels sharper than the light. Liana Carter pulled her coat tighter as she stepped out of her apartment, a travel mug of coffee warming her hand. Ridgeview's streets were quiet at that hour. Only the hum of distant traffic and the cry of a lone bird broke the silence. Her silver sedan waited in its assigned spot by the curb, beads of dew clinging to the hood. But as she drew closer, her stride slowed. Something was wrong. At first it was the color that struck her, a violent, glossy red sprayed in thick, uneven strokes across the hood and doors. The paint dripped in slow rivulets, running toward the ground like blood seeking the earth. A single word sprawled across the driver's side, crudely written in block letters, "Out." Liana's eyes swept lower. All four tires sagged flat against the pavement, the black rubber slashed and curling at the edges. The driver's side mirror hung useless, its wires exposed and dangling like torn muscle. For a long moment she stood there, the steam from her coffee curling upward, her mind quietly absorbing the scene. She had seen vandalism before in the city, but there was something more pointed here, an intimacy to the damage, as if someone had spoken through it. A movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. Across the lot, partially shielded by the line of parked cars, a girl stood frozen, one hand gripping the strap of her backpack. She was small, with dark hair pulled into a loose braid, her brown eyes wide with unease. Liana recognized her from third period. "Kayla!" she called, keeping her voice steady. The girl hesitated, then stepped forward slowly. I saw them," she whispered when she was close enough. "Last night. 3 of them. They were laughing. But they said—" Her voice faltered, and she glanced around, as if even the wind might carry her words to the wrong ears. "They said what?" Liana asked gently. "They said if I told anyone, they would make me regret it," Kayla murmured, the words barely audible. "I am sorry. I cannot." Her eyes held a mix of guilt and fear that Liana knew too well. She had seen it in students before, those who had been taught, by pain or by experience, that speaking out comes with a cost. "It is all right," Liana said, though inside she wanted to press for names, for details, for something tangible she could act on. "Get to class. I will take care of this." Kayla nodded, her shoulders still tense, and slipped away toward the main building. Liana set her coffee on the roof of the car, pulled her phone from her bag, and began taking photographs. She moved methodically, the hood from multiple angles, the dripping paint on the passenger door, each ruined tire, the shattered mirror. She crouched to capture the deep cuts in the rubber, knowing each image could serve as a record. When she was finished, she stood with the phone still in her hand, staring at the mess. Reporting it was the obvious step. Call the police, call the school, make it official. But she hesitated. A part of her, the part that had always chosen to handle things herself, whispered that going through channels would only drag this into a mire of excuses and delays. She would get answers faster on her own. She wiped her fingers across her coat pocket, tucking the phone away. The decision was made. The school day moved forward, but a subtle tension followed her into every room. Students whispered in corners, eyes flicked toward her and away again. By the time the last bell rang, she felt the weight of unspoken words pressing against her. She returned to her classroom to pack up for the evening. The sun was setting beyond the tall windows, staining the room with gold and shadow. Her desk was neatly stacked, graded essays on one side, lesson plans on the other. As she reached for her bag, she noticed it. A plain white envelope, no name, no return address, lay on the center of her desk as if it had been placed there with deliberate care. Her stomach tightened. She picked it up, felt the thin weight of a single sheet inside, and slid it free. The handwriting was large and uneven, the strokes heavy enough to nearly tear the paper. There were only 5 words, printed in black ink. "Check your classroom door tomorrow." She read it twice, the words settling over her like a cold wind. The hallway outside her door was empty. The last echoes of footsteps had long faded. She locked the envelope in her desk drawer and stood in the quiet for a moment longer, the faint hum of the building's heating system filling the silence. This was not random. This was a message, and whoever had sent it wanted her to know they were not finished. She turned off the lights, stepped into the hallway, and closed the door behind her. The lock clicked into place, but she knew it would not keep the trouble out. Not tomorrow. And not in Ridgeview. The next morning arrived with a restless wind that rattled the flagpole outside Ridgeview High. Leanna Carter pulled into the faculty parking lot earlier than usual, her mind still circling the anonymous note from the day before. "Check your classroom door tomorrow." She had expected something. She had not expected this. Her classroom door was plastered with paper, dozens of sheets taped in uneven layers, curling at the corners where the adhesive had already begun to loosen. As she drew closer, she saw the images and words. The first one stopped her cold. It was a photograph of her face, stolen from the school's website, altered crudely. Above it, bold letters spelled out a racial slur. The ink smudged as though applied in haste, but with deliberate cruelty. Other pages were filled with fabricated quotes, statements she had never made, each one designed to inflame. Offensive remarks about students, mocking caricatures, even insinuations about her personal life. Her breath tightened, but she did not tear them down. Not yet. Students began to gather, their conversations hushed, their eyes shifting between the papers and her face. She heard fragments of whispers, confusion, disbelief, and in some voices, reluctant amusement. Then a sharp voice cut through the murmur. "This is fake," Kayla said. The small Latina girl from 3rd period stood with her hands on her hips, her voice steady and loud enough for the nearest cluster of students to hear. "She did not write this. Someone made it up." Liana glanced at her, a flicker of gratitude passing between them. She stepped forward, pulling her phone from her bag, and began photographing each sheet, one by one. The camera's shutter clicked steadily, capturing every word, every crude drawing, every trace of tape. When she was finished, she unlocked the door and entered the classroom. The scent of chalk and paper should have been familiar and grounding, but there was a charge in the air, as if the room itself knew it was about to bear witness to something ugly. She set her bag down, powered up the projector for her first period lesson, and turned toward the board. That was when the light on the projector shifted. The screen flashed once, twice, and then filled with an image so obscene, so violently out of place, that a ripple of gasps broke across the room. It was a pornographic photograph, sharp and unavoidable, dominating the front wall. A wave of heat rushed to Liana's face, not from shame but from the sheer audacity of the act. She moved instantly, pressing the power button on the projector. The image vanished, leaving only the blank white screen. For a heartbeat, the silence was absolute. Then, from the back row, a faint, smug chuckle. Liana turned her head just enough to see Tyler Maddox, his phone tilted in his hand, his gaze fixed on her with a slow, deliberate smirk. She knew that expression. It was a test, not of her technical skill, but of her composure. She picked up a dry erase marker and, without acknowledging the interruption, began to write the day's topic on the board. "Character motivation in classic literature," she said, her voice steady. "Please open your books." There was no further disruption during the period, but the tension clung to the air, coiling tighter with each minute. Between classes, she documented the projector incident, photographs of the blank screen, notes about the timing, even a discreet snapshot of Tyler's posture during the moment. She slipped the papers from the door into a folder labeled Evidence. It was during her planning period that the call came over the intercom. "Miss Carter, please report to Vice Principal Keller's office." Dean Keller's office was an exercise in neutrality. Beige walls, neatly arranged certificates, a desk without a single loose paper. He gestured for her to sit, his expression practiced, his tone measured. "We have had some concerns raised," he began, avoiding direct mention of the papers or the projector, "about your interactions with certain students." Liana kept her voice calm. "You mean my enforcement of academic honesty?" Keller cleared his throat. "The boys in question feel that perhaps the situation was misunderstood. Emotions can run high. Sometimes a firm conversation is better than a confrontation." She met his gaze without blinking. "One of those boys attempted to steal from my desk. Another's essay was 60% plagiarized. That is not a misunderstanding." Keller's eyes flicked briefly to a file on his desk, then back to her. "Perhaps, to resolve this without further disruption, you could consider revising the grade. Offer a chance for resubmission. And—" he hesitated, as if weighing the word, "perhaps apologize for the way things unfolded." It was an offer dressed as a suggestion, but she could hear the weight behind it, an invitation to step quietly out of the storm. She thought of the red paint on her car, the slashed tires, Kayla's frightened whisper, the slurs on her classroom door, the smirk on Tyler's face as the projector flickered to life. Her answer was quiet, but each word landed with deliberate weight. "Number. The grade stands. I have nothing to apologize for." Keller's expression changed almost imperceptibly. The professional mask slipped just enough to reveal something colder beneath. His eyes, once politely detached, narrowed slightly, as if measuring her resolve. "Very well," he said after a pause. "But understand, Miss Carter, decisions have consequences." She rose from the chair, her spine straight, her bag in her hand. "So does silence, Mr. Keller." When she stepped back into the hallway, the air felt different, not lighter, not freer, just sharper, edged with the knowledge that a line had been drawn and crossed. And somewhere in the building, she knew Tyler Maddox would hear about this conversation before the hour was out. By the time the final bell rang, Liana's muscles ached from holding herself still for too many hours. The corridor outside her classroom was quiet now, echoing only with the faint slam of distant lockers. She locked her desk, checked her folder of evidence, and stepped into the cooling evening air. The parking lot was bathed in the amber wash of a sinking sun. She spotted Maya Fields waving from across the rows of cars. Maya's smile was the kind that seemed immune to the undercurrents of the day, bright, steady, and touched with mischief. "You look like you could use a rescue," Maya called, walking over in her worn denim jacket and bright scarf. "Is it that obvious?" Liana asked. "Only to those of us who have been here long enough to read the signs. Come on, there is a food truck 2 blocks down that serves the best fish tacos in the county. You need real food and fresh air." Liana hesitated. Her instinct was to go home, sort through the photographs, and plan her next move. But she also knew that the knot in her chest would not untangle without stepping away from the storm, if only for a short while. They walked together through the small downtown, the sidewalks glowing under strings of early evening lights. Ridgeview's main street was a quiet mixture of old brick storefronts and newly painted cafes. The scent of grilled meat and fried batter drifted toward them before they even saw the truck, parked beside a narrow park where children chased each other across the grass. Maya ordered for them both without asking, handing Liana a paper basket heavy with tacos and a bottle of cold mineral water. They sat on a wooden bench under a sycamore tree, the leaves above rustling in the mild breeze. For a while, they ate in silence. The food was messy and perfect, the kind that made it hard to dwell on anything else for a few bites. "You know," Maya began, brushing crumbs from her lap, "this town can be peculiar. Everyone knows everyone, but that does not mean they know the truth about each other." Liana glanced at her, curious. "Meaning?" "Meaning people will close ranks around the wrong person if it protects the name on the water tower." Maya's voice softened. "I have seen teachers leave because of it. Good ones. The Maddox family has been in this town longer than the streetlights. Robert Maddox knows which strings to pull, and Tyler knows how to play being untouchable." Liana let the words settle between them. "So you think this is going to get worse before it gets better?" "I think," Maya said carefully, "you are going to have to decide how much of yourself you are willing to put on the line. The truth costs more here." Ugh. Liana looked out at the park, where the last of the children were being called in by their parents. The shadows stretched long now, swallowing the edges of the grass. "I have been in fights before," she said quietly. "Some I chose, some I did not. But I do not walk away from them." Maya studied her for a moment, then nodded, as if confirming something she had suspected all along. "Then you will need allies. And you have one in me." The words warmed something in Liana's chest, though she did not say so aloud. They finished their meal, returned the baskets, and parted with a promise to check in before the weekend. The drive home was quiet, the radio turned low. Her mind replayed the day in fragments. Kayla's defiance, the papers on her door, the smug curve of Tyler's mouth when the projector flickered. She felt the fatigue settle deeper in her shoulders, but also a clarity in the path ahead. Her apartment building was still and shadowed when she arrived. The hallway smelled faintly of detergent, the light above her door flickering with a slow pulse. Something pale lay on the floor just inside the threshold, an envelope, thick and unmarked. She closed the door behind her, locking it with a decisive turn. The envelope was heavier than the one she had found in her classroom, the paper rough beneath her fingertips. She carried it to the kitchen table, sat down, and opened it carefully. Inside was a single photograph. Her own face stared back at her, but wrong, subtly altered, made into something she had never been, caught in a scene that was fabricated but meant to feel real. The manipulation was skillful enough to fool a casual glance, but to her eyes it was unmistakable. The clothing was not hers. The background was nowhere she had ever been. It was not explicit in the way of blunt images, but it carried the same venom, a deepfake designed to humiliate, to erode trust, to turn shadows into accusations. Liana set the photograph down, her fingers resting lightly on the edges. Her first sensation was not shame, but a cold, rising fury. This was not a prank. This was an escalation. She rose, crossed to the counter, and picked up her phone. For a moment she simply held it, staring at the black screen. She could still handle this herself. She could trace the file, find its origin, document it privately, but Maya's voice echoed in her mind. The truth costs more here. She dialed. After 2 rings, a steady male voice answered. "Officer Harris." "It is Liana Carter," she said. "I need to report something formally, and I think we need to talk about the scope of what is happening at Ridgeview High." As she spoke, she slid the photograph back into the envelope, sealing it as if locking away a piece of evidence in her own resolve. The fight had shifted, and now she was done playing on their terms. The morning after her call, the police station smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Officer Harris met Liana in a cramped conference room, the blinds half closed against the gray light outside. He had a stack of folders in front of him, each neatly labeled, and a laptop open to a series of network activity logs. "I think we have something," he said, sliding one folder toward her. "The school's IT system records every device that connects to its network. Yesterday, one of our tech analysts found repeated access to an unsecured wireless connection after school hours. It was traced to a student-issued laptop assigned to Tyler Maddox." Liana leaned forward, scanning the printout. The lines of code and timestamps meant little in isolation, but the pattern was obvious. The device had connected, accessed several restricted files, and uploaded data to an external drive. Her pulse quickened, not from surprise, but from the weight of possibility. "You think this is connected to the fake account? The projector? All of it?" "It is a lead," Harass said carefully. "It is not proof. Yet." The caution in his tone reminded her that in this world, intent was not enough. There had to be a chain of evidence, each link unbroken. She nodded. That afternoon between classes she created something new. It was a simple digital form, buried on a secure server and reachable only through a code she posted in the far corner of her classroom whiteboard. Anonymous reporting, Ridgeview High. She stood back, marker still in hand, and considered it. Students could send their stories without fear of their names being exposed. It was an invitation to speak into the dark, hoping someone was there to listen. By the end of the day, the inbox was no longer empty. The first messages were short, single sentences about insults in the hallway, stolen belongings, threats murmured under the breath. Then came longer ones, paragraphs describing months of intimidation, patterns of cruelty that were never written into any official report. And then, Kayla's. She found Liana after the final bell, waiting at the edge of the classroom as the last student left. The hall beyond was already thinning, the echo of voices fading. "I used your link," Kayla said quietly. "But I want to tell you in person, too." They sat, the desks between them like a fragile barrier. Kayla's hands twisted in her lap as she spoke. "Last year, Tyler cornered me behind the gym after practice. He said if I told anyone about what he had done to another student, about how he shoved him into the lockers and took his phone, he would make sure I could not get into the college I wanted. He knew where my brother worked. He said he could make him lose his job." Her voice broke then, the words shattering into silence. Liana felt the sting of anger under her ribs, sharp and immediate, but she kept her own voice steady. "You did nothing wrong, Kayla." "Nothing." Kayla nodded, but her eyes were far away. "I just thought, if you are going to fight him, you should know how far he goes." That night, Harass called again. His voice was brisk, almost energized. "We have enough probable cause to seize the device," he said. "Tomorrow morning we will collect it from his locker." It felt like momentum. For the first time in weeks, there was the outline of a victory, small but real. Liana slept with the folder of student statements on the nightstand beside her, as if proximity could protect them. But the next day, victory dissolved in seconds. When Harass emerged from the administrative office holding the laptop, his expression had already told her. In the evidence room, he opened it, and the screen lit with a pale blue glow. "Everything's gone," he said. "The drive has been remotely wiped, operating system reinstalled. This was done less than an hour ago." The news landed like a stone in her stomach. "So there is nothing?" "Not nothing," Harass said, already pulling a small device from his pocket and attaching it to the laptop. "Wiping deletes the map, not the terrain. Forensic imaging can recover fragments. It is slower, and the defense will fight every step, but we can still pull something back." Liana sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "How did they know to wipe it now?" "Could be luck, could be someone tipped them off. Either way, it makes the judge more likely to sign off on a broader search. If they were willing to destroy data, what are they hiding?" She watched as he worked, the quiet clicks of his tools punctuating the air. The room felt both too small and too open, like the walls could not keep the danger out. Hours later, Harass straightened, rubbing his temple. "We will need a warrant for the Maddox residence. If we can get it, we might find backups, external drives, maybe even the original files." He began drafting the affidavit on the spot, each word chosen with precision. Liana read over his shoulder, the language stark but compelling. Probable cause, pattern of harassment, digital evidence, destruction. When he was finished, he placed the document into a folder and looked at her. "We are taking this to the judge tonight." She followed him through the dim corridors of the courthouse, the echo of their footsteps magnified in the stillness. The judge's chambers smelled faintly of old wood and ink. A single lamp lit the desk where the warrant was read, line by careful line. The pen scratched across the paper, the sound crisp as a blade. The judge handed it back to Harass without ceremony. Warrant granted. In Liana's chest, the cold knot that had lived there for weeks shifted, not loosening, but changing shape. This was not the end. It was the opening of another door. One she had been pushing towards since the first moment Tyler Maddox had stepped into her classroom. And now, there was no turning back. The morning unfolded under a sky the color of dull steel, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Ridgeview High's corridors felt colder than usual, the chatter of students sharper, carrying whispers that shifted like dry leaves along the floor. Liana Carter moved through it with her lesson plans tucked under one arm, the warrant from the night before still echoing in her thoughts. She reached her classroom before the bell, unlocking the door with the small key she kept on a chain around her neck. The room smelled faintly of pencil shavings and yesterday's coffee. On the whiteboard, she wrote the day's objectives in neat block letters, pausing for a moment to steady herself. Today, she would do something she knew would ripple far beyond these walls. When the bell rang, the students filed in. Among them came Tyler Maddox, the swagger in his step as deliberate as a signature. He dropped into his seat without looking at her, leaning back as if the desk were a throne. "Mr. Maddox," Liana began, her voice level, "you have accumulated more than the allowed number of unexcused absences. Your most recent essay was also found to be over 60% plagiarized. You will serve detention this afternoon in my classroom." The words hung in the air for a heartbeat. Tyler's head turned slowly toward her, a smile curling at the edge of his mouth. Not warm, not even amused, but designed to draw the eyes of the room toward him. "Detention?" he said, his tone dripping with disbelief. "You really think you can make me sit in this room after school?" "You will be here," Liana said, "or you will face the academic consequences." He laughed then, a low sound that rolled across the rows of desks. "Do you know who my father is? Do you know what happens to teachers who think they can punish me?" Liana's gaze did not waver. "This is not about who your father is. This is about your choices. And the rules apply to you as much as to any other student." A few students exchanged glances, their pens hovering over notebooks, unsure whether to look down or keep watching. The tension in the room grew taut, like the drawn string of a bow. Tyler leaned forward now, resting his elbows on the desk. "You can try, Miss Carter, but I promise you, I am not the one who will regret this." Inside, Liana felt the familiar burn of adrenaline, the same sensation she had before a match. Heart steady, senses sharpened. She thought of Kayla, of the anonymous reports, of the image sealed inside that envelope at home. Every choice she made here had to show her students something, that fear was not the only option. "Then we understand each other," she said. The rest of the period moved under a veil of unease. Tyler's eyes followed her when she turned toward the board, his smirk never fully disappearing. A few times she caught students sneaking glances at him, then quickly back to their notes, as if afraid to be caught observing the standoff. When the final bell for that class rang, the students gathered their things with unusual speed, the scraping of chairs against the tiles sounding louder than normal. Tyler lingered in his seat for a moment, meeting her gaze one last time before standing. His exit was unhurried, his footsteps deliberate. Liana moved to her desk, stacking the graded essays in a neat pile, already planning the quiet rhythm of the detention period. She imagined the clock ticking down in the silence, her presence a reminder that some boundaries could not be shifted by intimidation. But then the door opened again. It was not Tyler. Robert Maddox stepped inside first, his presence filling the room like a sudden drop in temperature. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and a tailored suit that spoke of money and authority. His hair was perfectly combed, his eyes scanning the space as if it belonged to him. Behind him came two members of the school board, their expressions measured, almost neutral, but their arrival here, in her classroom, was anything but casual. "Miss Carter," the mayor said, his tone polite but heavy with the kind of formality that did not mask intent. "We need to have a word." The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. In the stillness that followed, Liana realized that detention day had just become something far more dangerous. The mayor's shoes made no sound on the polished classroom floor, yet the space seemed to tighten with each step he took. Robert Maddox stopped midway between the doorway and Liana's desk, his tailored suit catching the thin morning light. The two board members flanked him like silent sentinels, their expressions carefully composed, their eyes measuring. Vice Principal Dean Keller appeared a moment later, slipping in quietly and closing the door behind him. He carried a clipboard, though he did not look at it. His gaze moved between the mayor and Liana, as if trying to read the unspoken rules of the meeting before they were announced. "Miss Carter," Robert began, his voice a careful blend of courtesy and warning. "I am here today not only as the mayor but as a parent. My son tells me you have decided to issue him detention, and in doing so, you have taken a step that could cause unnecessary conflict in this community." Liana straightened. "Mr. Maddox, your son has repeatedly violated the school's attendance policy and submitted plagiarized work. The detention is a consequence outlined by the handbook. This is not about community conflict. It is about accountability." Robert's eyes narrowed slightly. "You speak of accountability as if it exists in a vacuum. But actions have ripples, Miss Carter. The decisions you make here affect more than just a classroom." Keller shifted his weight, stepping forward. "Perhaps there is a middle ground," he suggested. "Tyler is a senior, a key player on the football team. We have the playoffs approaching, and his academic standing is vital for eligibility. Maybe we can find an alternative to formal detention, a make-up assignment perhaps." Liana could feel the trap forming. Soften the consequences, preserve the image, keep the machine running. She glanced briefly toward the back of the room. Maya Fields had entered quietly, holding a folder, her phone resting casually in her hand as if she were checking messages. But Liana knew that angle, the slight tilt of the device. Maya was recording. Robert took a slow step closer. "We are in the final stages of securing a multi-million-dollar contract for the new Ridgeview Sports Complex. This is not just about football. It is about jobs, growth, the town's reputation. Disrupting our athletes at this stage risks jeopardizing the project, and by extension, the community's prosperity." There it was, the motive laid bare. The football program was the crown jewel, the centerpiece of his sports complex pitch to contractors and investors. Tyler's image, his record, his uninterrupted dominance on the field, it all fed into the mayor's narrative. "I understand the value of community projects," Liana replied, her tone measured. "But protecting a student from consequences to safeguard a construction contract is not education, it is politics, and I am here to teach, not to shield anyone from their own actions." Robert's voice cooled further. "You may think you are standing on principle, but principles do not pay for textbooks. Principles do not bring in new families. We are offering you an opportunity to be reasonable." The clock on the wall ticked with exaggerated clarity. Liana felt the old reflex to compromise stir, the temptation to step back for her own safety. But she remembered Kayla's trembling voice, the red paint on her car, the deep-fake photograph sealed in its envelope. "I am being reasonable," she said. A silence followed, thick and deliberate. Robert straightened his jacket, turning toward Keller. "We will revisit this with the board," he said. "I trust you will advise Miss Carter on what is in her best interest." When they left, Keller lingered for a moment, his face unreadable. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," he said quietly. Then he followed them out, Maya across the room to Liana's desk. "You kept your ground?" she murmured, her phone still in her hand. "And you might want to know, I have the whole thing." That afternoon blurred into a sequence of movement and intent. Officer Harass in the evidence room, sealing devices in tamper-proof bags, his gloved hands methodical. Denise Holt, the district's legal counsel, drafting chain of custody forms and logging each timestamp with precision. The hum of forensic imaging machines creating bit-by-bit copies of hard drives, the slow progress bar crawling across a dark screen, signatures exchanged in triplicate, each document passed from one set of hands to another, the weight of procedure heavy in the air. By evening, Harass called Liana to the station. In the evidence lab, an analyst pointed to the directory tree of a seized external hard drive. Among folders labeled with innocuous names: game footage, budget reports, schedules. There was one that stood out: leverage. The folder was locked with encryption, its contents unreadable without a key. Harass looked at her over the glow of the monitor. "We cannot open it yet, but the name alone." Liana stared at the word, the digital letters sharp against the screen's pale light. She could almost feel the pulse of what might be inside. Secrets stored as insurance, weapons meant to control and silence. For the first time that day, her hands curled into fists. Whatever was in that folder, it was worth protecting, and that meant it was worth finding. The late autumn sun hung low over Ridgeview Civic Green, a thin, wintry light spilling across the lawn like brushed copper. But the warmth in its color was an illusion. There was no softening the chill in the air or the sharper chill in the crowd's voices. The smell of damp leaves mixed with the faint tang of hot coffee from a vendor's cart. But even that homely scent could not mask the undercurrent of tension. Rows of folding chairs had been set in neat lines before the temporary wooden podium, but many of the roughly 200 people who had come refused to take their seats. They stood in tight knots, crossing their arms, leaning close to whisper, or gesturing with quick, impatient movements. Every cluster seemed to have its own orbit of agreement or suspicion. From her position near the side of the crowd, Liana could feel the split as clearly as a physical boundary line. On one side, the faces carried something like guarded hope. They wanted to hear the truth, to see some form of accountability. On the other, the expressions were hard, set with the belief that she was an intruder, an agitator threatening the town's image of harmony. The moderator, a local school board member with an already fraying voice, tried to call for order. "Let us proceed," he began. But his words were swallowed by overlapping voices. The phrases came in volleys: reputation, integrity, community spirit. To some, those words were shields. To others, they were weapons. A tall man, wearing a faded Letterman jacket from decades ago, stood up and declared that the school's football team had put the town on the map and that some misunderstandings should not destroy futures. A woman in a navy coat, her arms locked tightly across her chest, shot back statistics on harassment in schools and the long-term damage to victims. Liana felt her jaw tighten. This was not just a meeting. It was a trial without rules, one where the verdict would be shaped as much by old loyalties as by truth. Then the microphone shifted into new hands. Kayla stepped forward. The wind caught the ends of her scarf and tugged them like small banners as she reached the podium. Her fingers gripped its edges, knuckles pale against the wood. She took one slow breath, and for a heartbeat, her voice wavered. "Some of you know me," she began, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "Some of you only know what you have heard. I am a senior here. I used to believe our school was safe, but when Tyler Maddox cornered me after practice and told me what would happen if I spoke against him, I stopped believing that." A ripple of noise rolled through the listeners. From the left side of the lawn, a man's voice rang out, "Lies!" From the right, another voice snapped back, telling him to be quiet. Kayla's hands tightened, but she did not flinch. "He told me he could ruin me, that my friends would turn on me. And when I saw what he did to others, what he tried to do to Miss Carter, I knew he meant it. You do not have to believe me. But if you have ever been afraid to walk into a building where you are supposed to learn, you know what that feels like." Her last sentence trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of its truth. Liana felt the dual surge of pride and fury rise in her chest. Pride that Kayla had the courage to speak this aloud, fury that it was necessary for a 17-year-old to bear that burden. She let her eyes scan the front row until they found Mayor Robert. His jaw was set, his mouth a straight, controlled line. But his eyes were restless, flicking over the crowd as if measuring the swing of opinion. The air seemed to hold its breath. Then Officer Harass approached the stage. He was not a man who liked the spotlight, but in his uniform, framed against the deepening gold of the sun, he drew it naturally. He let the quiet stretch for a moment before speaking. "We have concluded our forensic analysis," he said, his voice amplified by the small PA system, steady and deliberate. "Evidence recovered from a secured device confirms that Tyler Maddox engaged in the production and distribution of harmful digital material targeting multiple students. This evidence is admissible in court. A warrant for his arrest has been signed and will be executed tonight." It was not applause that followed, nor silence. The reaction came like a sudden squall, gasps, sharp whispers, bursts of disbelief. A small group at the back clapped openly. Another, nearer the front, shook their heads, muttering about vendettas and political games. Liana's gaze returned to Robert. His face was carved in stone, but his hands betrayed him, gripping the back of a folding chair so tightly the metal frame trembled under the pressure. Kayla stepped down from the podium, her cheeks flushed, and was quickly surrounded by a small circle of students. Some placed hands on her shoulders. Others leaned in to whisper quick, quiet words of thanks. Across the lawn, a knot of parents moved toward the mayor, speaking in low, urgent tones, their expressions urgent but unreadable from this distance. The meeting's close came without ceremony, conversations frayed and scattered. People drifted away in twos and threes, still talking, their glances cutting across the emptying lawn. The civic green felt like a battlefield, where one volley had ended but the next might come at any moment. Liana did not linger. The November air was dropping into a colder register, and she could feel the weight of eyes on her back. Some eyes were warm, almost grateful. Others carried an unspoken warning that set a fine edge along her spine. She walked the 2 blocks to her car. The pavement was slick with the residue of fallen leaves, and her footsteps sounded louder than they should have. A passing pickup slowed as it went by. The driver's gaze locked on her before it rolled on. She told herself not to read into it, but the unease clung like static. By the time she reached her own street, the light had thinned into the deep violet of early night. Her house waited in quiet silhouette, the front porch light casting a pale halo on the steps. Inside, it smelled faintly of cedar from the coat rack, the air still from being shut up all day. She set her bag down on the chair by the window and pulled out her phone to check messages. That was when the doorbell camera chime broke the stillness. The screen lit in her palm, the preview image blooming in grainy twilight resolution. Someone stood at the very edge of her porch, unmoving. Their hood was drawn low, shadow, swallowing most of their face. They were not holding a package. They were just waiting. The figure on Liana's porch did not move. For several long seconds, the frozen image on her phone screen felt like a still frame from a film. Grainy shadows, the curve of the hood, the faint outline of shoulders rising and falling with controlled breaths. Then the doorbell camera feed flickered, and another shape slipped into view, taller, broader. The two stood side by side, silent. A chill passed over her skin, cold enough to make the small hairs on her arms stand upright. She had locked the door the moment she came in, She was certain of it, but the confidence faded as she watched the smaller figure lean forward toward the keypad. Her phone chimed. Smart lock. Access granted. Her breath caught. She had not touched the controls. She had not spoken a word. Yet the deadbolt clicked, a sound as small and harmless as a teacup on a saucer. But to her it was the sound of her defenses splitting open. The door eased inward. They entered with the slow precision of people trained not to waste movement. Neither spoke. The taller man's hands were bare, his skin pale under the porch light, his steps soundless on the rug. The smaller one, compact build, wiry, closed the door behind them and turned the lock again. Their eyes swept the living room, not like thieves, but like men cataloging a space for tactical advantage. What they did not know, what their contractor had not told them, was that Liana Carter had spent years teaching young women to survive situations far worse than this, and she had learned to keep herself alive long before she taught anyone else. She did not run, she did not shout. She stepped backward into the shadowed space between the kitchen counter and the hallway, her right side angled toward them, her stance subtle but ready. Every part of her training whispered the same truth: survive until help arrives. The taller one saw her first. "There is no need to make this harder," he said, his voice flat. "We just need to talk." The smaller one moved 2 steps closer. His hands were empty, but his posture radiated pressure, shoulders slightly forward, weight balanced on the balls of his feet. Liana's mind registered it instantly. This was an approach position, a setup for a grab. She drew a slow breath and let it anchor her. "Stay where you are," she said, her voice calm enough to sound almost conversational, but loud enough to be recorded clearly by the tiny camera lens above the mantel. They did not stop. Her heels slid half an inch to the left, her body turning more sideways. BJJ defensive posture, knees bent, arms up but relaxed, eyes fixed on their centers of gravity. Distance. Always distance. The kitchen island became her first barrier. Every step they took forward, she matched with a measured retreat, never giving them a direct line. The smaller man's patience snapped first. His left hand twitched as if to reach, but she pivoted with a short sidestep, using the countertop's corner to force him into a wider angle. Her voice sharpened. "This is being recorded. The police are on their way." Even as she spoke, she had already pressed the emergency shortcut on her phone in her back pocket. The alert went to Officer Harass directly, bypassing dispatch. She knew his cruiser would be minutes away, but those minutes had to be survived. The taller man moved to flank her. She shifted, never letting him box her in. Twice, the smaller one lunged as if to close the gap, and twice she used BJJ footwork to escape, short shuffles, low pivots, hips turned to keep her frame between his path and her center line. It was not about attacking. It was about denying them control. From somewhere outside came the faint crackle of a police radio. The taller man heard it. His eyes flicked to the front windows, his jaw tightening. The smaller one cursed under his breath and made one last push forward. Liana's stance absorbed it. Her lead arm posted lightly against his shoulder, while her back foot slid just far enough to keep him from locking onto her wrist. A sharp knock thundered against the front door. "Police! Step back from the homeowner!" Everything shifted at once. Harass's voice carried the full weight of command. The intruders froze. In 3 swift motions, the taller man's hands went up, the smaller one back toward the wall. The door opened to flood the living room with cold air and the blue-red pulse of cruiser lights. Harass entered first, 2 officers right behind. "Hands where I can see them." The men complied, but their eyes stayed locked on Liana, as if trying to burn some unspoken message into the air between them. Within moments, the officers had them cuffed. One officer read them their rights. Another retrieved a small tablet from the taller man's coat pocket, a portable hacking device with a cable still attached. Harass met Liana's eyes. "They got in through your smart lock," he said quietly. "Your camera feed caught the whole thing." It was not relief she felt, not yet. Only the thudding release of adrenaline, the trembling in her hands that she held at her sides so no one would see. The two intruders were led out to the waiting cruisers. One of them, the smaller, twisted his head just enough to look back at her. There was no anger in his eyes, only a calculated chill. She had seen that look before, in depositions and in locker rooms after hard games. The look of someone who knew this was not over. Harass stayed behind as the other officers took statements. "They will be booked tonight," he told her. "You will each get your own copy of the charges: criminal trespass, unlawful electronic entry, and attempted assault. The judge will add a no-contact order by morning." Liana nodded, her breath finally slowing. "They were not here to talk," she said. "No," Harass agreed. "They were here to intimidate you. Or worse." The paperwork was quick, a blur of signatures and dates. By the time the cruisers pulled away, the neighborhood was awake. Porch lights glowed in scattered houses, silhouettes shifted behind curtains. A couple stood on the sidewalk, murmuring to each other as they watched the last patrol car disappear. Liana closed the door and leaned against it. The living room was exactly as it had been before. Same couch, same lamp, same folded throw blanket, but the air felt altered, as if some boundary had been crossed that could not be resealed. She reset the lock manually, feeling the solid weight of the bolt slide into place. Harass stood at the threshold a moment longer. "Be careful tomorrow," he said. "This will not stay quiet." He was right. By dawn, the first calls came. A local reporter left a message asking for a statement. An email from the regional paper followed an hour later. When Liana drove past the school just after 8, she saw the beginning of it. 2 vans parked across the street, satellite dishes angled toward the sky, cameras resting on tripods, their lenses already turning toward the building. The story had broken. The air in the school gym carried an unusual weight that morning. It was not the heavy scent of varnished bleachers or the echo of a basketball bouncing somewhere in the distance. It was expectation, thick, electric, humming in every whisper that passed between rows of students and teachers. A temporary stage had been set against the far wall, draped in deep blue fabric that caught the light from the high windows. A podium stood at its center, flanked by the district flag and the state flag. Behind it, a banner read in bold, clear letters, "Safe Voices, Strong Schools." Liana sat in the second row, the front reserved for members of the school board and district administration. She kept her posture steady, her face calm, but her hands, folded neatly in her lap, betrayed a faint tremor. Around her, she could feel eyes shifting, some warm with support, others cold, weighing, calculating. Principal Harass stepped to the podium, adjusting the microphone. His voice carried easily to every corner of the room. "Today," he began, "we take a step forward. Not a perfect step, not the last one we will take, but a clear one." He outlined the new whistleblower protections, policies that would ensure any student or staff member could report harassment, discrimination, or misconduct without fear of retaliation. Anonymous reporting channels would be available, backed by a legal commitment from the district to investigate every claim thoroughly. As he spoke, Liana scanned the crowd. She saw Kayla, seated with her classmates, leaning forward, her eyes bright with a mix of pride and fierce focus. She saw Maya in the back row, phone in hand, quietly recording. And she saw Robert Keller, arms crossed, his expression unreadable but his gaze fixed on Harass like a man measuring the ground beneath his feet. When Harass finished, a ripple of applause moved through the gym, not unanimous, but strong enough to be felt in the chest. Liana clapped, not because she believed the policy would fix everything overnight, but because it was a start. After the assembly, the tension eased. The wide hallway outside the art room was alive with color and laughter. Sheets of poster paper were spread across long tables, each one exploding with marker strokes and painted slogans. Students worked in small groups, their sleeves pushed up, their hair tied back, focused on building something that was theirs. The literature club had decided on a recruitment drive, and Kayla was at the center of it. She stood over a half-finished poster with a brush in one hand, the other planted firmly on her hip. "Too much glitter," she said to a boy sprinkling silver across the top edge. "There is no such thing as too much glitter," he replied, grinning. Liana, passing by on her way to the staff lounge, paused in the doorway. "I think it looks good," she offered. Kayla turned, mock serious. "Do not encourage him, Miss Carter. Next thing you know, the entire school will sparkle." A small group laughed. The sound was light, genuine, a momentary breach in the wall of seriousness that had surrounded them for weeks. Liana let herself smile before moving on, carrying the brief warmth with her. That warmth was tested hours later. The board meeting room was smaller than the gym, but the air felt hotter, heavier. Folding chairs were arranged in tight rows, everyone occupied. At the front, beneath the crest of the district, the 7 members of the school board sat behind a long table. The group of parents loyal to Maddox had come prepared. Their spokesperson, a tall woman in a cream blazer, stepped forward to the microphone. Her tone was measured but edged with steel. "Miss Carter's continued presence in this school is divisive. Her actions have brought negative attention, damaged reputations, and created an atmosphere of hostility. We call for her immediate termination." Murmurs swelled and broke like surf. Liana sat still, her hands folded once again, feeling each word strike against her like small stones. She had known this was coming. Knowing did not make it easier to hear. One by one, others rose to speak. Some echoed the call for her removal, citing the disruption her defense of students had caused. Others rose in her defense, parents, former students, even one quiet custodian who spoke simply of respect and dignity. When the floor closed, the board chair called for the vote. It was done without ceremony, without the drawn-out debate some had expected. 4 votes to retain her, 3 against. The decision landed like a sudden breath after too long underwater. Liana let her eyes close for half a second, then opened them again, careful to show no visible triumph. This was not victory, it was permission to keep standing. That night, her desk lamp was the only light in the quiet house. Papers lay scattered, policy drafts, lesson plans, a flyer for the literature club's event next week. The day's noise had faded, replaced by the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Her phone chimed. A new email. The subject line was simple. From Tyler. She hesitated before opening it. The message was short. "Miss Carter, I know it is late for this. I am sorry for what I did. I was wrong. I hurt people. I hurt you. I do not expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I am not the same person now." There was no flourish, no request, no explanation. Just those words. Liana leaned back in her chair, the screen's glow painting her face in pale light. The apology did not erase the harm, did not undo the nights of fear, the bruises left on others, the fractures in trust. But it was something, a shift, however small. She closed the laptop slowly, the room settling into silence again. Outside, the streetlight cast its steady glow across the front porch, and for the first time in days, she let herself breathe without counting the seconds until the next battle. The email arrived before dawn, when the sky was the color of pressed ash, and the town still breathed in a slow, unbroken rhythm. Liana sat at her kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea, the surface steaming against the early chill. She opened the message and read it twice, as if a second reading might reveal the invisible seam where dream ends and daylight begins. From Office of the State Superintendent. Subject: statewide pilot announcement and advisory appointment. They wrote of data. They wrote of testimony. They wrote of the anonymous reports that had been investigated and the measurable change inside Ridgeview's hallways since new protections took root. They wrote, finally, of a decision. For the next 12 months, the state would pilot Ridgeview's model in selected districts. Training for administrators, a secure reporting system with independent review, strict safeguards for whistleblowers, and clear disciplinary paths that did not bow to pressure. The letter named her as an advisor to the task force that would guide the pilot and measure its outcomes. Her mug touched the table with a soft porcelain knock. She felt the room grow larger, or perhaps it was her chest, opening in a way that was not exhilaration and not relief, but something steadier. She did not think of victory. She thought of promises, and what it costs to keep them. She drove to school in the pale wash of morning, the streets empty except for the bakery van making its rounds and an old couple walking a dog that sniffed every leaf. Her phone vibrated once on the passenger seat. A message from Maya, "Proud of you. Wear the blue dress. Today is big." Then another from Officer Harass, "I will be on campus. The press wants comments. I will herd them." By the time the first bell rang, there were vans clustered at the curb with their dish-shaped antennas pointing to the sky. Reporters stood at the fence line, the breath from their morning coffee visible in delicate white curls. Inside the building, the students moved in pairs and small clusters, their voices hushed as if a snow had fallen, and they were walking on something newly sacred. At 10 in the morning, the district assembled its staff and students in the gym. The banners from the last championship hung like fragments of a story the town remembered with uncomplicated joy. Principal Harass stood at the podium, and the superintendent stood at his side, hands clasped in a careful steeple. On the far right, the empty chair for the mayor remained empty. The superintendent spoke with the measured clarity of someone who expected to be quoted. "The state has decided to adopt a pilot based on the Ridgeview model," she said, and the murmur began, low and not unfriendly. "For 12 months, select districts will implement these protocols with independent oversight. We will collect data on student safety, response times, and outcomes. We will listen, revise, and improve. We will not pretend that policy alone changes culture, but we will begin where schools can and must begin, by guaranteeing that voices can be heard without fear." "No." She turned slightly toward Liana. "We have asked Miss Liana Carter to serve as an advisor to the state task force. She brings the insight of a classroom teacher, the discipline of a coach, and the courage of a citizen." Applause rose, uneven at first, then strong enough to ripple the fabric draped behind the stage. Liana stood because it would have been awkward not to, and because sitting would have felt like refusal. She did not wave. She inclined her head. She sat again, pulse steadying as she fixed her gaze on the banner that read, "Safe Voices, Strong Schools." Afterward came the corridor of congratulations. Teachers who had avoided her eyes 2 months ago now touched her arm, not in ownership, but in thanks. The custodian who spoke at the board meeting lifted a hand from his cart and said simply, "You did not give up." In a corner by the trophy case, 2 freshmen argued quietly about whether they should testify in a pending code of conduct review. Their argument was not whether to speak, but how to do it best. Culture does not turn like a key, she thought. It leans, then it shifts, then it rests, then it leans again. The first task force meeting took place in a conference room at the state capitol. The building had marble floors polished to a pale glow, and windows tall enough to show the line where clouds met river. Around the table sat a latticework of professions, a data analyst with a braided bun and a habit of tapping her pen, a veteran principal from the coastal district whose voice carried the salt of old storms, a parent advocate with a thick folder of letters, and attorney Denise Holt, her posture straight and her notes exact. Liana listened first, because the habit of listening had saved her many times. She offered details when asked: how students actually use the anonymous link, how quickly rumor corrodes trust, how a single adult's indifference sets fire to a hallway. She described the day the projector flashed with images that did not belong in a classroom, and the silence that followed. She told them what it feels like to stand in front of 30 students and decide, in a breath, whether to bend or be the fulcrum. "What is the failure point we are not seeing?" the analyst asked. "The moment after a student speaks," Liana said, "courage opens the door. What they meet on the threshold decides if the door stays open. You need trained responders, consistent timelines, and consequences that do not vanish when the lights are off." They drafted a plan that did not sound like a press release. It had dates and names, a calendar for training, a clear path for investigation, and a promise to publish results. Not just the numbers that would look good, but the ones that would not. In the weeks that followed, she traveled to districts that had agreed to pilot the model. She met a counselor in a town hemmed by fields who had kept careful notes in a notebook worn at the corners. She met a science teacher who had never raised his voice in 20 years, but had begun to take attendance with a new kind of attention. She met a girl who resembled Kayla in the tilt of her chin and the fierce endurance in her eyes. The girl did not speak in front of others, but after the meeting she handed Liana a folded paper with a list of names. "Please look into them," she whispered. "Not all of them are for discipline. Some of them need help." Between visits, she returned to her own classroom and found the small acts of future building still waiting. A student who had discovered a poem that made him speak more slowly. A girl who had not raised her hand all year, now tracing sentences with the reverence of someone touching a relic. The literature club taped their posters with fewer arguments about glitter, more jokes about a winter reading challenge that would end with hot chocolate in the library. There were setbacks. There were emails that attempted to turn progress into an accusation. There were op-eds that spoke of overreach and the loss of tradition, as if tradition were a fragile vase rather than a living tree that must be pruned to grow. There were moments when she felt the old exhaustion rise, the one that says, "You have done enough, step back." When those moments came, she called Maya, who told her a ridiculous story about a faculty salsa night, and then said, with a humor that did not undercut its seriousness, "Rest and then return." In late spring, the task force held a public update. They presented early numbers that were not triumphant, but honest. Increased reporting, faster response times, disciplinary actions that matched policy, and, most tellingly, a rise in students opting to resolve low-level conflicts through mediated conversations rather than silence or retaliation. The superintendent stood at the podium and said, "We are not finished." Liana wrote in the margin of her copy, "Good. We should never be finished." On a quiet evening, after one of these meetings, she sat on her porch and watched the last light leave the maple at the curb. The air smelled faintly of rain that had not yet fallen. Her phone buzzed with a message from Kayla, home from her first week at a summer program. "I spoke up for someone today. It felt like returning a favor. Only better, because it felt like passing it on." The last day of the school year arrived under a sky that belonged to summer, bright, generous, and unafraid. Liana parked behind the gym and walked the long corridor that still carried echoes from the championship banners. She paused at the door to her classroom, feeling the familiar pulse of that space before the first bell. She remembered the day the door had been plastered with lies, and the way her hand had trembled not with fear but with the force of what she refused to accept. She opened the door. They were waiting for her, students lined in 2 rows, faces solemn for exactly 3 seconds before the first sign rose, and then another and another. The words were handmade, letters in blue and green and gold, some straight, some skewed, all eager. "Thank you, Miss Carter." A second sign read, "You kept the door open." A third simply said, "We will do the rest." For a heartbeat, the room blurred. She did not like crying in public, and she did not now. But the catch in her breath betrayed what she felt. She smiled. And it was the kind of smile that holds both gratitude and resolve. "Take your seats," she said softly, though there were no seats that could contain that moment. "We have one more story to read." They laughed and settled, the signs propped against backpacks and desks. She opened the book on her desk and touched the first line with her finger. The day was bright. The future, imperfect and possible, stood just outside the window like a field that needed care more than applause. When the final bell of the year rang, the sound lifted through the hallway in a scatter of shouts and footsteps. She stood at the door and wished each student a good summer. Some hugged her. Some could not, but their eyes were enough. In the evening, the district posted a short video from the task force on its website. It ended with a simple slate of text over a field of quiet color. Carter's law is under committee review. The words did not promise a miracle, they promised a process. They promised that somewhere, a door was opening in a room she could not see, and people had entered to do the work of turning one school's endurance into a state's commitment. Night fell over Ridgeview. Liana turned out the lights in her classroom and paused in the doorway one last time. The hallway smelled faintly of dust and cardboard boxes, of endings that are really the quiet beginnings of what comes next. She locked the door, listened to the click, and walked toward the parking lot under a sky alive with the first stars. She did not think of victory. She thought of mourning. She thought of the long road and the small steps, of the weight of a hand on a podium and a voice that refuses to break. She thought of Kayla's message, of the signs, of the promise she had made without ever saying the words aloud. And as she crossed the threshold into the warm night, she knew with a certainty that steadied her breath. This was only the beginning. The last light of day lingers just long enough to gild the edges of Ridgeview's rooftops, as if the town itself wishes to hold on to the moment. In the quiet after the bell, the hallways breathe differently, less like walls that contain, more like corridors that carry. Liana's footsteps echo alone now, each one a reminder of the road that brought her here. She passes the bulletin board where the first ugly flyers once clung, and instead finds announcements for book clubs, debate meets, and a blood drive. It is not perfection, but it is proof. Change rarely arrives as a roar. It slips in like a draft beneath a door, quiet and persistent, until you realize the air itself has shifted. Outside, the evening settles in with the smell of cut grass and the faint hum of summer insects. She stops at the edge of the lot, watching a pair of students walk side by side, their conversation unguarded, laughter unburdened. For them, the battles she fought will remain stories, unless the world forgets to keep fighting. And that, she knows, is the real danger. Because courage is not a single act. It is a choice remade each day, often without witness or applause. It lives in the teacher who listens longer than she has time for, in the student who speaks even when his voice shakes, in the bystander who decides silence is not safety. It is not the absence of fear, but the decision to step forward in spite of it. And here, perhaps, is the truest lesson Ridgeview has given, that standing up is never about winning a single moment. It is about building a bridge, strong enough for others to cross after you. The story you have just heard is not a closed chapter. It is an open invitation. Somewhere, in another school, another town, another quiet corner of the world, someone is waiting for a voice that says, "You are not alone." You could be that voice. You could be that presence. If this journey moved you, let it not end here. Share what you felt. Tell the world in your own words. Leave your thoughts below, not just for me, but for those who will come searching for proof that change is possible. And if you wish to walk further with these stories, stay close. There will be more paths to travel, more voices to lift, more doors to keep open. Liana turns the key in her car, the headlights sweeping briefly over the school's facade. For a heartbeat, it looks different, lighter somehow, as though the building itself has learned to stand taller. She drives away, not into an ending, but toward the horizon where the next story waits.